Okay, so the paper that I'm going to present today is joined with Claudia Olivetti and Barbara Petrongolo. Both are in the audience. So Barbara will be monitoring this session. So if you have questions, you can type in the chat room. So the paper we study here is about structural transformation and U-shaped female labor supply. Both of these phenomena are quite well documented. The U-shaped relationship between women's labor force participation and development, and the structural transformation along the development path where we see agriculture declining, manufacturing has a hump shape, and services is rising. In this paper, what we are going to do is to investigate whether and how these two patterns are related in historical perspective. And through that, we will hopefully be learning something, and that will be useful for developing countries as well. So, first figure. This is the typical figure people have shown about the U-shaped female labor supply. On the y-axis is the female employment rate. On the x-axis, you see the log GDP per capita, which is a proxy for development. What we see here is for 17 high-income countries, spending from the period of 1840 to 2005. So the relationship can be roughly summarized by a U-shape, where the fit control for country fixed effect, and you can see that both the level of GDP and the square of GDP coefficient are significant. Where does structural transformation come in this picture? So what we do, just to motivate our study, is to combine this with the medicine data on the share of agriculture, manufacturing, and services. So the red line here you see is the same quadratic fit you see in the previous figure. And what we do here is to show you if you control for agriculture share and the square, which is the green line, you see that the line is flattened a lot. So you can compare that. The decreasing part of the red line is basically absorbed by the agriculture share. Then the orange line, in addition, control for the share of services. So that means the orange line now is comparing to the green line. And it shows that when you, in addition, controlling for services, the upward sloping line has become flattened as well. So this gives us sort of a motivation where it sets that the declining part of the U shape in the quadratic fit seems closely related to agriculture share, whereas the rising part of the U shape seems to be closely related to the service share. And that what we do in this paper, so that was our motivation, that gave us some sort of idea that these two phenomena are related. So what we are going to do in this paper is to dig deeper into the data, where we are going to provide historical data on employment by sector, hours per employee, and using the time use study and the industry structure. So with these data, we propose a framework that simultaneously trying to generate both the U-shaped female labor supply and the structural transformation. We have some particular focus here on the family enterprise and home production. Both of these are unpaid work, but they have a significant differences, which is home production is for the own use, like cooking, etc. Family enterprise is that during early stage of development, we've seen family farm where the head of the household will run a farm and the family member will help, and the produce will be sold to the market. So that's the key difference. Because of this key difference, input into the family enterprise is part of the labor supply because the output is supplied to the market. And this is consistent with the ILO definition of labor supply. With these two focuses, there are three processes that is going to happen in the model. One is the modernization process, where you see family farm over time are replaced by large-scale market farm, okay? And there's a process of marketization, which I mentioned in my introduction, which is home production is being outsourced to the market, and that gives you the decline in home production and the rise in services. The last process, the structural transformation process, which tells you the reallocation of resources across the production of agriculture, manufacturing, and services. So that's basically what we do in the paper with data and a framework to explain the data. So where do we fit in the literature? Now, of course, because of the time, I cannot give you a full list of literature. So here I just highlight the thing that we really stand out from the literature. With respect to the U-shaped female labor supply and the woman's role in family enterprises has been pointed out by Claudia Golden in her book and by Stephen Ruggles in a series of his work. What we do in addition from the data side is basically to point out the hours by sector and the employment by sector as well. And related to there has been a literature that linked structural transformation and female labor supply, but that link very often focus on the increasing part of the U, linking the increasing women's participation is due to the expansion of the service sector. In this paper, what we are going to do is look at both the declining part and the increasing part of the U, so simultaneously. Finally, there's a large literature on structural transformation. What we do to that literature is simply by highlighting the role played by family enterprise. So that's where we stand in terms of the literature. Let's see what we do here. So first of all, let me give you a flavor of the data part. So when we look at the data, there's a challenge here because the official US Census data, if you look at pre-1940 definition of labor force participation, is based on the concept of gainful employment. So that very typically exclude unpaid family work because that gainful is really like you are getting paid some wages. So it doesn't include family work in that. The definition, however, changed in 1940 to be in line with the ILO definition. So if you just take the official census data for female labor force participation, very often you get a monotonic increase. But as shown by Claudia Golden, if you adjust for the unpaid family work, then female labor force participation in the 19th century can be as high as 1940. So that's the first important observation from Claudia Golden. And recently, Ruggles have a series of papers documenting the importance of family enterprise in the 19th century, all through to the first half of the 20th century. And that observation is mainly based on the idea that a lot of family actually live on the farm. And before 1900, wage work is very rare that is paying enough to support a whole family. So it's very hard to have a male breadwinner kind of family model where just the head of the household work and the rest of the family can stay home. So that is just not feasible. So in fact, he documented from 1800, majority of the family have this kind of family enterprise setting. Either there's a family farm, if they live on the farm, or if they live in more urban area, there will be some kind of family business where the whole family help. And it go all the way until the 20th century, we see this sort of male breadwinner kind of model where you have the head of the household, the man usually, earning the income, and the woman is a full-time housewife. And more recently, in the post-war period, we'll see more evolution of the dual earner, where both the husband and the wife are working.
Rachel, we cannot see the figure actually. Did you want to show the Ruggles figure here?
No, I'm not. Just the slide here.
Ah, okay. I thought you were clicking on the figure.
No, I didn't. I could show the figure when we have time later. Okay. So that is basically the idea there. The family enterprise is very important for the early 20th century and the late 19th century. So what do? Then we follow Ruggles. We go to the 1850 census and then trying to find out how important are these unpaid family work. Okay? So here are two figures here. There's a lot of things here. So you have to bear with me in terms of explaining how these things work. So we have a figure for women and a figure for men, which document the percentage of women employed in each of these 5 sectors. So what do I have here? I have the dark green, which is the usual market agriculture farm. So it's like market farm. The mint color here is the unpaid family work in agriculture. So these are the women who work on family farm. The purple is unpaid family work in manufacturing and services. So for example, they might have a little lodger that let people come and stay in, and the woman will help out there. So that is a family business. The dark blue here is the manufacturing sector, which is very little for women in the 19th century. And the orange here is services. So what do we take away from this figure? Well, there are two things to note. First of all, it tells you the total employment for women is a U shape here. So the employment rate of women here over time is a U shape, which is confirming what we've shown earlier on. It was 70% in 1850, and it declined to about below 50% around 1950, and it rise again. So there's an overall U shape here for the women's employment rate. Second thing to notice is what contributes to this fall in the women's employment rate is due to the unpaid family farm. It's due to the fall in the family farm that contribute to the declining part of the U shape. Whereas the rising part of the U shape is due to the increase in services, which is this orange area. Okay, so that sort of reassure what we said in the beginning, which is the declining part of the U shape is due to the falling agriculture, whereas the rising part of the U shape is due to rising in services. For men, it's a different picture. First of all, men did not have that U-shaped pattern. The overall is just declining. Second, men does not have such important role in the unpaid family farm or in the unpaid family work, which is almost invisible here. Okay, so there's also a gender difference here to be noticed. Okay, so that it basically concludes our evidence in terms of all the market work by gender. Then one naturally think about, okay, so does this U shape in women, meaning their total market work fall, implies that woman is enjoying more leisure? So now women have less work to do, so they're enjoying more leisure? Apparently not. So this is a figure taken from Francis and Ramey, documenting the total hours worked for from 1900 to 2010. So the total working hours here is the sum of market hour and home hours. So what we've seen from here is both men and women, the total hours worked is rather stable. So what does that say, combining with the previous picture? It is true that the previous picture is about bodies. It shows you that, you know, in terms of percentage of people, percentage of women is falling and then rising. But what we know from medicine is that hours per employee has been falling throughout, and because work week are shorter, hours people work per day are shorter. So the falling body is going to be reinforced by the falling hours per employee. So this falling market hour for women is there, even if you look at the hours because of time. So I won't be showing you the picture on hours. But what you can take away from here is the U shape will also hold once you put it in terms of hour per person. So what does it mean is that there is an important substitution margin between market hours and home hours, because the total hour is quite stable over time for both men and women. So if we want to understand the U-shaped female labor supply, we have to take into account the substitution margin between market and home. So let me just sum up all the historical evidence I have run through. So first, we gave you a motivation that linked U-shaped female labor supply to structural transformation, where the decline is associated with the decline in agriculture and the rise is associated with the rise in services. Second, we use the data, follow the methodology by Ruggles and show the importance of unpaid family work during the 19th century and how it falls over time. Third, we see that women are the ones who are concentrated in family farm and in the service sector. Fourth, total work, home plus market, is rather stable for both men and women, so the margin of home and market work are important. So the next, how much time do I have, Barbara? Hello? All right.
You're on mute, Barbara.
I'm sorry. 20 minutes, Rachel.
Okay, That's great. Okay, so now I can go through the mechanism we have in mind to show you what the framework will look like. So there are three important elements for the model, okay? There will be three market sectors. So there will be market firms in these three sectors, the agriculture, manufacturing, and services. And then there will be two more sectors for people to allocate their working time. It is the family farm and the home production sector. So as mentioned earlier on, the key difference between these two is that output of the family farm is for the market, whereas output for the home production is for own use. So therefore, the labor input into the family farm will be part of the labor supply. And allowing these two sectors also with the home production also allow us to look at the substitution margin across market and home. The third important element that differentiate the behavior of female versus male is that these different sectors use female labor input with different intensity, which is something that we've seen in the data earlier on. The utility function is a standard CES utility function. It's nested, so you have three final goods of consumption: agriculture, manufacturing, and services. You purchase manufacturing directly from the market. For services, there are two ways you can produce this, to enjoy these services. You can either produce it with home production, which is CH here, or you can purchase it directly from the market, which is CS. Now, agriculture manufacturing are three very different kind of goods. So we assume that they are poor substitutes. The elasticity is less than 1. Within the service category, these are quite similar goods. So the elasticity of substitution would be assumed to be bigger than 1. What do families do? They allocate their time into whether to help with the family farm to make home production, which is cooking, cleaning, etc., or allocate their time to the market firms. Okay, so these are the three-way family allocate their time. The production function for the family farm and home production, and also for the market firm, will be this CES structure. It has a use labor only. Okay, so the female labor and male labor has an elasticity of substitution equal from there. Psi here capture the importance of female labor in this particular sector J. Okay, so a higher psi J will means that woman labor will be more important in this production. And AJ here is just a sector-specific productivity index, and that could be different across sector. Now, the budget constraint illustrates the differences between the family farm and home production, because what we see here is time that you allocate in the market to earn wages is taken out from your total available time, which is LM, and you spend the time on the home production and the time on the family farm. So the input is taken from your total time constraint, but the output of the home production enter into utility, whereas the output of the family farm production will be sold to the market at this price PM. Okay, so that is the key difference that family farm stand out from a difference from the home production. In the market, you also have three sectors in the market. Each sector has some representative firm, and they use this CES production function with a similar structure, and also the technology and the female intensity parameter is going to be the sector. And you have the standard labor market clearing and goods market clearing condition for manufacturing and services. For agriculture goods, so you can imagine the following situation. There are all these family farms producing agriculture output. They are going to sell to the market at the price PM, okay, in the market. And then you have the market firm producing agricultural goods, selling to the market also at PA. And these two types of agriculture good is like different variety. So they are combined together into this final good, A tutor, which is an agriculture final good. So the elasticity across these family farm produce and market farm produce is this sigma n. They're all agricultural produce of different variety, but with a elasticity bigger than 1. So that's the basic setup of the model. And what we do in the remaining 15 minutes is basically to give you a favor what is happening in the model, and how do we use this model to understand the U-shaped female labor supply and to use it to understand the structure itself. So what is labor supply here? Just like the ILO definition, it will be the labor in the free market sector, agriculture, manufacturing, and services, plus the family farm labor. Okay, so that will be the total labor supply. We make some assumption to these production parameters, basically following what we see in the data. So we will assume family farm will use female labor more intensively than the market farm, because that's what we see in terms of the allocation in 1850 for the men and women. We see a lot more women in the family farm, and most of the men are in the market sector farm. And then we will assume the service production will be more intensive in female labor. Again, this is what we've seen in the data earlier on. And in terms of productivity, we assume that the market firm benefit more from productivity growth. This could be due to, for example, economy of scale. So you have the market agriculture growing faster than the family farm in terms of productivity, market service productivity growing faster than home service. And finally, the productivity growth in the free market sector is ranked so that the service production has the slowest productivity growth. These are all motivated by what we observe in the data. Now, with these assumptions, we can sort of summarize what is happening in the model with this picture. What this picture does is to tell you where labor will move. So there are three processes here. The yellow arrow tells you the structure transformation process. So this process is, as in the literature, is basically because there are three types of goods I like. I like to consume food, agriculture. I like to have clothes. I also wanted to have services, okay, like healthcare services. These three types of goods have very poor elasticity of substitution. Because agriculture has faster productivity growth than manufacturing and services, over time, how could I maintain the utility from these three types of goods? I have to reallocate resources away from agriculture because it has very fast productivity growth into manufacturing and into services. And similarly, because manufacturing has a faster productivity growth than services, resources have to reallocate from manufacturing into services. So over time, what you see is labor will move away from agriculture and into services. This is to give me an equal number of goods in terms of agriculture, manufacturing, and services because they are poor substitute. So that is the structural transformation forces. And within agriculture, there are two types of firms producing agricultural goods: the family firm, the family farm, and the market farm. Because market farm benefit from economy scale and other factors, family farm has higher productivity growth, and these two are good substitute. So over time, labor will reallocate from family farm to market farm. And this modernization process will rationalize what we've seen, the shrinkage of the declining of the family farm in the data. Okay, so there's a reallocation here due to the modernization process. Within services, there's two ways of producing services: home production and market sector. Because the market service has faster productivity growth, and these two output are good substitute, so over time, you will see resources, labor, reallocate from home service to market service. And this is the marketization service. So these three flows basically capture how labor moves across sector and how it contributes to the process of the U-shaped female labor force labor supply and the structure transformation process. So I will skip this slide because I already ran through it. And because of time, I will skip the equation, and we have question later on, we'll come back to it. What I will focus on is to explain the intuition, how this framework can rationalize the two patterns we observe in the data: the U-shaped female labor force, labor supply, and the structure transformation. So think about what is happening in the data. starting from 1850, okay, this is the time that you have a large overall agriculture sector, okay? Majority of people are working in agriculture, either working on family farm or working on market farms, okay? So there's a big agriculture sector, and agriculture itself is going through this modernization process, meaning that the family farm is reallocating into the market farm. Because of this reallocation, and because market farm grow faster, has a faster productivity growth than the family farm, this modernization process is actually making the overall agricultural productivity growth even faster, okay? So this, together with an initial very large size of agriculture sector, give you a very strong structural transformation force. And this strong structural transformation force is pushing agriculture share down and increasing total service share. Then we know that there's a marketization force, which is making home service to go into market service. But because the structural transformation force is much stronger at this stage due to the large overall agriculture sector, what we see that is the net outcome is that both home service and market service will rise. What does that imply? The increase in home service itself, this home market substitution, increase in home service itself will imply a fall in total labor supply, okay? Because in this model, we abstract from leisure, we focus on the home market substitution. So if the home service rise, it implies that the overall labor supply will fall. And it will be connected to the fall in the agriculture share. So this is the first stage. Now, how does gender come into this? It's because that family farm and home service use female labor more intensively, okay? So this force in the labor supply is much stronger for female labor because it was women who are mainly working in the family farm. So the decline in family farm really drive women into the home production. And that gives you a larger decline in the female labor supply. So that gives us the first part of the U, the declining part of the U linked to the decline in agriculture share. Now, what happened in stage 2? So this is around, mid-20th century, around 1940, 1950. By this time, the overall agriculture is already small. Okay, so the employment in agriculture, whether it's and family farm, almost disappear. Okay, so you have about 10% of people in agriculture at this point. So the structural transformation force become weak. Okay, because there's not much to in the agriculture to start with. So this is a time when marketization force will dominate the structural transformation force. Remember, the marketization force is driving the market service up, reducing the home service. So therefore, the reduction in the home service, the reduction in the home hour will be translated to an increase in labor supply. So what we've seen is a simultaneous increase in market service and in labor supply. And how does gender play here? Again, because market service is more intensive in female labor. So the marketization process will have a larger effect on women than men, and that will result in a larger rise in female labor supply relative to men. So this gives us the rising part of the U, which is associated with the increasing share of the service sector. So then
you have 4 minutes.
Okay, so and basically, so that summarized the mechanism of the model. And because of the time, I'm not going to give you any equation, but essentially what we can, what we do in the paper is that you will have these 5 sectors people have to allocate time to, and there will be equilibrium variable in terms of time allocation, in terms of output prices, in terms of gender wage ratio. So the set of equilibrium equation, with some algebra, you can reduce it to basically 2 equations, 2 unknown. One for the female, one unknown is the female home share. 1 minus this female home share give you the female labor supply and the gender wage ratio. And then you can solve the model, and that basically give us what I explained to you earlier on. So let me just summarize. So what we have hopefully convinced you with such a short presentation is that the declining part of the U-shaped female labor supply is related to the decline in agriculture, especially through the shrinking of family farm. The rising part of the U-shaped female labor supply is related to the rise in the market service, especially through the fall in the home production in that marketization process. So I didn't have time to show you the work we have done in terms of hours for the data. In the data part, I show you the bodies, but we have been working on the hours. So there are two things to note in terms of the hours. One is pre-1940, we do have to find different sources for the market hours in agriculture, manufacturing, and services. And then the second aspect is about how to allocate the time people spend on unpaid family work versus the home production. Because all we know is these hours are unpaid, but whether it's people will report it as home production or into market hour, that we have to investigate. So we have found some time use survey that show you what a homemaker do, how much they did on the farm work and how much they do on the household work. So this is the part of the work in progress that we are working on. So because of time, I'm not showing you more on this, but if we have a question later on, we can talk about it. So finally, what we wanted to do is once we have assembled all these data, then we will wanted to conduct a quantitative analysis to see how important are these three mechanisms that we have discussed: the marketization, modernization, and the structural transformation process for the U-shaped female labor supply. So I will stop here and answer questions. So I might go back to some of my slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Perfect timekeeping. So during the talk, there were a couple of clarifying questions. So I think these are sorted. So probably we can open to the floor if there is any question from the audience.
Barbara, I have a question, but I, for some reason, couldn't figure out how to raise my hand, so I'm just going to jump in. Rachel, can you go back to your slide with the pictures on? The one where you're showing the three boxes.
The three boxes, yes.
Yeah, that one. So I'm thinking about how we kind of use this framework to think about implications for developing countries, and thinking about, what are the parts of this that apply to developing countries right now, or how can we modify this to end? So your green arrow, your family farm to market farm, and then the red arrow, home services to market services. It seems like one useful way of thinking about adapting this framework would be if you see any constraints or anything that kind of interrupts the green arrow or anything that interrupts the red arrow, that's going to slow down these forces of modernization and marketization, and may be useful in thinking about what specific constraints get in the way of making that shift from family to market. So the one thing that comes to mind is like, land markets. So land markets in the US probably didn't look much like land markets in many developing countries today, and maybe that's a force that sort of slows down the patterns of transition in developing countries. So I guess that's not really a question, it's just kind of a comment. I liked this the slide because it sort of highlights very clearly where we might start to think about constraints that matter in developing countries today in making this framework kind of shift or produce different patterns for many of the poorer countries that STEG is interested in.
Yeah, thank you, Taryn, for the comment. Indeed, this is the case. If you think about many of the developing countries here, like the other theme that talk about agricultural productivity gap, very often, the land market is very important. One of the very important things finding there is the average farm size is much smaller in developing country. And that is because many of these are sort of so-called the family farm. So I myself have worked on something on China related to the agriculture in China. There, the land policy also play a very important role in restraining the development of the agriculture sector in China, you see much smaller farm compared to what you see in developed country, like in the US. You have 2 or 3% of people working in agriculture, producing huge amounts of agricultural output. But in many developing countries, you see many more people working there on a smaller farm, more inefficient farm, and etc. But I think overall message is the development of the market sector is important, because you can imagine, so here I give you a stylized model, but you could imagine in each one of these boxes, you have this family firm versus the market firm. So you can have the family run corner shop versus a big supermarket, which is much more efficient, or in the market service thing, or you can think of some family produced textile output versus a big manufacturing textile firm. So the development of the market in the developing country, I think it is one of the important things, and it's very much related to the historical experience of many of today's rich countries. I saw Richard also raised hand. So.
Oh, thanks. I wasn't sure it was working, and in some ways I wanted to kind of, I guess, echo what Taryn had said, which is, I think I didn't necessarily catch all of it in the presentation, but this transition from family farm to market farm is about the industrial organization of farming. And it seems, I mean, obviously for simplicity and transparency, you kind of don't talk about land, but I think part of being a family farm is you own, I mean, you could rent some farm, but historically in the US, a lot of those people owned land. And there's also the rural to urban as part of that. So it seems, to carry this over to talk about developing countries, I do think introducing land and talking about the industrial organization of agriculture is probably the next place where it's important to add a lot of more detail.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good comment. Yeah, definitely. I see another hand.
Oh, sorry. Did you finish commenting on Richard's question?
Yes.
Okay, so you have to. Yeah.
But I completely agree. It's something that right now we give a very stylized way of thinking how this shrinking family farm can contribute to female. But to understand the process itself, you can really dig deeper, especially when you link up to today's developing country. Yeah.
You have 2 more raised hands by Janneke. Would you like to just go ahead and ask your question, Janneke?
Hi, yeah, thank you.
Hello.
Thanks for the talk. And I'm glad that we're here at this this figure. Because I have a comment, maybe more than a question, but you discussed briefly that you had some issue around the 90-40 change in the definition of labor force participation, which is when, if I understood correctly, the ILO definition started including unpaid family work. So I thought this would be maybe important to mention that I'm not sure if you're aware, but if we're going to study this process of modernization in developing countries, and it's related to what Doug Cullen is was just writing in the chat, but the definition has changed again in 2013, and now the production of goods that are primarily intended for own consumption, so not just services but also goods, is no longer officially considered employment. And so that's going to mean that in official, or at least ILO statistics on labor force participation, especially smallholder farmers in low and middle income countries, many of those work primarily for own consumption. And so many of those will not be considered officially employed unless they have some other job, right? And so I think it's just good to keep in mind that working with these ILO data is going to be pretty challenging if we want to understand this process for developing countries going forward. And so I hope that, and I think many of us already do, but we just need to work with country-specific labor force surveys where we can tease out the labor force participation defined the way we want to define it rather than the official definition.
Indeed, no, I completely agree. So when I refer to the ILO definition of pre-1940, I'm talking about the US Census pre-1940 that is being based on gainful employment. But you're right, there for each country, we should look at their own and then decide how we should be classify labor force, labor supply. One of the key things that, as you mentioned, is that for own use, okay, whatever production that is for own use, the way I classify it in the model, and I think in the data, we think of it as home production. What the family firm here, whether it's a family farm or a family making some small manufacturing goods, is that they sell to the market. Okay, so that will be the part that will be in the labor supply, because the output is being sold to the market, even though it's produced inside the family, but the output is being sold to the market. Whereas the for own use will be, think of if you make jam for your own family, that will be home manufacturing, and that will not be part of the labor supply. So I completely agree with you. One have to look into the individual country in order to be correctly getting this time series over time consistently, and which is what we did in what we do in this paper, which is to focus on the historical US data.
You have a question from Doug Gollin, so which is related to what Janneke was talking about.
Okay.
Doug?
Sure. My question is just how you're thinking about what the difference is between the family farm and the market farm in terms of why you see differences in the gender composition of labor used in the two, and whether that's kind of whether I should think of that as a demand side thing, that the market farms are demanding a different gender composition of the labor force, or is it a supply side story, which in a way is, I think, where you're coming from. But I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about where that difference comes from, or whether you just want to leave it for the time being as something unspecified that just matches the data.
Yeah, so short answer is at the moment it's quite, just pinned down by the data. But, if you think about what's happening, what are these family farms, is that during that period of time, most family actually live on the farm, okay? So there's a head of household who own a farm, and then majority of the family member will help in, especially the women there. So one could think of perhaps, there are stories that say women prefer to work for the family business because it's at the same time it facilitates them to be able to produce home production. So they find it more convenient to work for the family business. I think even in today's developing countries, sometimes this kind of intuition is there that sometimes women work for the family business because it's also convenient for them to do the home production, maybe give them more flexibility for childcare and for other things. But these are just intuitively speaking. I don't have a precise data to tell you, how much is due to this reason or that reason. But at the moment, in terms of the modeling, it will be just taking at the female intensity in the data, matched into that production parameter. But the story behind this, convenience for home production could be one of the story in the data.
Thanks.
Rachel, you have one more question by Elvisa Drishti. Elvisa, would you like to just answer your question yourself?
Hi, hello.
Hello.
I was just listening to your presentation and watching the model, and just saying that from my experience with working with LFS data for Albania, which is a non-EU country, non-OECD country, there are so many other forces that need to be maybe integrated for developing countries, and that maybe hidden markets like illegal products and also informal work maybe should find some way to be accounted for in the case of developing countries. That was to answer one of the questions that was previously made for developing countries. So I was just thinking about the case of Albania while looking at the model.
Yes, so indeed, you can think of there's also the informal sector, which is maybe in between family firm and market firm. So they are in the market, they may have a bigger size than the family firm, but not to the full scale, not to the full scale as the formal firm, which are bigger scale. So this, you could, when you adopt it to developing country, one do have to allow for this margin of the informal sector, which tend to be much larger in today's developing country. Yeah, so I do agree with that. So yeah, this is a stylized framework to think about things, but I think the framework can be generalized to allow for these other factors. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have 2 more minutes. I think there's time for an extra question. I see a raised hand by Joe. Joe Kowalski.
Hi, thanks.
Hi.
Barbara. It's a really nice paper. Some very nice empirical facts, and then a model with a very clear mechanism that explains the facts. I guess I had one comment and two questions. The comment is you kind of use like the historical data to evaluate the mechanism, but it also seems like there's some cross-sectional stuff that could evaluate the mechanism too, at least at the farm level, which is some countries are dominated by small family-owned farms, others have large plantations early on, and I just wonder whether that would line up. And then I had a question about the model, the elasticity. So it wasn't clear to me what was sort of, you fit the facts through calibration, and what's kind of out of sample tests of the model. Like, and in particular, I guess I was curious about what identifies the elasticity between female and male labor in the production functions. And then the third comment is just kind of like a general comment, which is this is a model that fits the facts, but are there any kind of policy counterfactuals that you could run using the model that might be informative for developing countries today?
Thank you, Joe. These are very good comments. I actually quite like the comment about the cross-section part. I think that is also related to what you say at the end about policy on the developing country, I think. Because, so I think one thing we haven't looked at is if we manage to get the data on the size of the family firms and how it changed over time, would that actually give us a different picture for the different pattern of, say, female labor supply? I suppose that's what you have in mind when you have the cross-section in mind. We haven't done that. I think this is a good suggestion. We should look into it. Now, turning into the model and the calibration thing. So at this point, we haven't really, show you any quantitative result. But the idea is, you're right, the original idea, to be honest, I would have taken this elasticity parameter to be given, and then feed in the productivity growth and measure the female intensity parameter using the initial observation on the female intensity, and then let the productivity growth predict what will happen to the female labor supply and the structural transformation. Now, this is one thing that I have in mind, but maybe you're right, maybe it's worth also to look at whether we can actually come up with an estimate between on the elasticity across female and male labor. Maybe that elasticity itself could be changing somehow, but that is something that we should look into. In terms of policy, Taryn will also touch on this. I think it's related to many work. So I think I also answered that in the beginning when Taryn mentioned it. I think there's a fundamental theme here is that to have this process happening, the development of the market sector are important, okay? And there are many policy relevant questions there for the development of the market sector. Even the infrastructure, but basic infrastructure can be important. For example, transportation can be important. With the transportation, that might allow for development of market firms. So, we haven't systematically draw out a set of policy implications for developing country, but it's definitely something that we should look into. But the basic theme is I think the development of the market sector, the productivity growth of the market sector are all important in terms of this process that's being pointed out here. Thank you.
So thanks very much for all the questions. That was really very useful. And I think we really have to close this one session, this one presentation, and move to the next one. Thanks a lot.